He was young, handsome, and born into a world where luxury was not a dream but a daily routine. Arthur Vasconcelos, a name whispered with admiration in elite circles, printed in glossy magazines, and envied by everyone who only saw the surface of his life. He lived in a mansion that overlooked the ocean, where every sunset painted the walls in golden tones, and every night was followed by the soft hum of waves crashing below. Yet, despite all this beauty, his world was cold and empty. Arthur had inherited his father's empire at only 24, after a tragic car accident took both his parents. Since then, he had become a prisoner of his own fortune. The house that once echoed with laughter now felt like a mausoleum. The grand halls were silent, the chandeliers gathered dust, and the air itself seemed heavy, as if grief had taken permanent residence there. He spent most of his days locked inside his enormous bedroom. The curtains were always drawn, keeping the sunlight away. The once luxurious space, with its marble floor, leather armchairs, and giant bed, had turned into a dark, suffocating cage. Arthur lay in bed for hours, staring blankly at the ceiling, his mind trapped in a spiral of despair. He had everything that money could buy, yet he couldn't buy peace, couldn't buy meaning, couldn't buy the will to live. His depression had grown silently, like ivy creeping up the walls of his soul. He stopped answering calls, stopped attending meetings, and pushed away everyone who tried to get close. His friends, business partners, even the loyal staff, all were met with the same cold indifference. "Leave me alone. I don't need anyone. I'm fine," he would say, even though everyone could see he wasn't. His employees learned to avoid him. Meals were left by the door, untouched. The piano in the main hall, which his mother once loved to play, had gone silent years ago. Even the roses in the garden, her favorite, had withered, as if mourning with him. Arthur had built walls around himself, not made of stone, but of bitterness and loneliness. He believed people only cared about his money, not his soul, and so he shut his heart completely, wearing arrogance as a shield against the pain he didn't know how to heal. At night, when the world outside was quiet, the silence inside his room became unbearable. He would open the old photo album, looking at his mother's smile, a smile full of light and kindness, and his eyes would fill with tears he refused to let fall. Sometimes he would whisper to the darkness, "If I have everything, why does it hurt so much?" But no answer ever came, only the echo of his own emptiness. He began to despise everyone around him, the housekeepers, the gardeners, the driver, not because they had done anything wrong, but because their presence reminded him that he was still alive while everything that mattered to him had died. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The mansion became an island of silence, surrounded by luxury but inhabited by sorrow. Arthur was the king of a kingdom of loneliness, rich, admired, desired, but completely broken inside. And then, when no one expected it, destiny decided to intervene. Because sometimes the universe sends light in the most unexpected form, not through wealth or fame or luxury, but through someone who carries nothing but a kind heart. And that someone was about to knock on Arthur's door. The mansion on the hill had grown colder with time. Every corner seemed frozen in silence, as if the very walls had stopped breathing. Dust gathered on the chandeliers, mirrors lost their shine, and the once glorious garden was now a graveyard of wilted roses. Arthur's staff came and went, unable to bear the weight of his moods. Some said he was cruel, others whispered he was cursed, but the truth was simpler. He was broken, and no one knew how to fix him. One early morning, after yet another housekeeper quit in tears, the old butler, Mr. Duarte, made a decision. He had been with Arthur's family for more than 3 decades. He had seen Arthur grow up, smile, love, and lose everything, and now seeing him waste away in darkness was more than he could endure. "I'll hire someone new," he murmured to himself. "Someone different." That's when Isabella appeared. She arrived at the mansion on a cloudy Tuesday, carrying a small bag and a heart full of quiet hope. Her dark brown hair was tied back in a loose braid, her eyes large and full of warmth. She wasn't like the other maids the mansion had seen. She didn't move with the stiff obedience of someone afraid to lose a job. She moved with grace, the kind that comes from humility, not fear. She had lost her parents young and learned early that kindness could survive even in the harshest places. To her, work wasn't just about cleaning dust or polishing floors. It was about restoring life to spaces that had forgotten what it meant to shine. When Mr. Duarte explained her new Duties, he warned softly. Do not go near the master's room. He does not like to be disturbed. Speak little, work quietly, and above all, avoid asking questions. Isabella simply nodded. I understand, she said, smiling gently. But sometimes silence is what hurts the most. Those words stayed with the old butler long after she walked away. On her first day, the house felt like a haunted palace. The echo of her footsteps seemed almost disrespectful in the vast halls. The marble floors reflected her image, fragile and determined. As she dusted the paintings, she noticed one that caught her attention. A portrait of a young woman with kind eyes, wearing a soft blue dress. That must be his mother, she whispered to herself. Everywhere she looked, there were traces of a happier past. Books left open, a piano covered in dust, a cracked teacup beside the window, as if someone had once sat there to watch the rain. The air was heavy, not from dirt, but from sadness. She could feel it, the loneliness lingering like perfume that refused to fade. When lunchtime came, she saw the butler placing a tray outside a locked door at the top of the stairs. His room? She asked softly. Mr. Duarte sighed. Yes. Don't go near it. He doesn't speak to anyone. But does he eat? Sometimes. That night, when the staff had gone and the house grew still again, Isabella walked past that door. She didn't knock. She only stood there for a moment, listening. From inside came faint sounds, the slow creak of the bed, the soft click of a pen, then silence again. She whispered under her breath, Whoever you are, I hope you find light again. She didn't know that, at that very moment, Arthur had paused. Somewhere in the silence of his mind, he thought he had heard a voice. Soft, warm, unfamiliar. The next morning, Arthur awoke to find his room slightly different. The curtains had been pulled open just enough to let a single ray of sunlight in. The tray by his door had a small note. Attached, Good morning, Mr. Vasconcelos. The day looks beautiful today. Maybe it's time to see it. Isabella. Arthur frowned, irritated. Who dares? He muttered, crumpling the note. But later that afternoon, he caught himself glancing toward the window. The sunlight made the dust shimmer like golden snow. For the first time in months, he didn't feel completely numb. He refused to admit it, but something in that woman's quiet courage intrigued him. She was just a maid, one of dozens who had passed through his house, yet her presence felt different. In the following days, he began to notice little things. The piano downstairs was no longer silent. It had been polished, the lid slightly open as if inviting him to play. The garden, once dry and lifeless, showed signs of new roses blooming. There was even the faint scent of lavender in the hallways. Everything she touched seemed to come back to life. Still, he avoided her. When he heard her footsteps, he pretended to sleep. When she hummed softly while cleaning, he turned away, though deep inside he was listening. He told himself she was nothing, just another employee, just another temporary shadow in his empty world. But the truth was undeniable. For the first time in years, something had changed. Arthur, the man who wanted nothing to do with life, was beginning to feel curiosity again. And that single emotion, small, fragile, but real, was the first crack in the wall he had built around his heart. Days turned into weeks, and Isabella slowly became part of the rhythm of the mansion. Or rather, she created one. Where there had been silence, there was now the soft hum of her voice. Where dust had gathered for months, there was now the subtle shine of care. And though Arthur pretended not to notice, he saw everything. He noticed how every morning the curtains in the hall were open, never all the way, just enough to let in the right amount of light. He noticed how the scent of fresh coffee and cinnamon lingered near his door, even though he never asked for it. And most of all, he noticed the faint sound of her laughter echoing from the kitchen, light and melodic, like a melody he once knew but had long forgotten. He didn't understand why it bothered him, or why it comforted him. Each day he found himself listening, not out of interest, but because her presence somehow made the house feel alive again. It irritated him, yet he couldn't deny it. He had spent months rejecting everyone, and now, this young woman, with her quiet grace, was slowly undoing all his carefully built walls. The day everything changed. It was a late afternoon in early autumn. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, and the air outside smelled of rain. Arthur had just woken from a restless sleep when he heard the door creak open. He sat up instantly. His voice was low, sharp, and cold. Who told you to come in here? Startled, Isabella froze in the doorway, holding a tray of food. She had thought he was asleep. Her eyes widened, those warm brown eyes that carried no fear, only an innocent kind of surprise. I'm sorry, sir, she stammered, her voice soft. I didn't mean to disturb you. I just wanted to bring your dinner while it was still warm. Arthur frowned, irritated. I said I didn't want to see anyone. For a moment, the silence between them stretched. She should have left. Any other maid would have rushed out in fear. But she didn't move. She stood there, trembling slightly, yet something in her eyes refused to look away. And then it happened. Their eyes met. It was a long, still moment, the kind of moment that feels like it lasts forever. Arthur's anger faltered. There was something in her gaze that disarmed him completely. A calmness, a softness, a sadness that mirrored his own. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. He saw, reflected in her eyes, not the arrogant millionaire the world knew, but the broken man he truly was. And she saw beyond his coldness, beyond the darkness of that room, into the soul of someone who had forgotten how to live. She took a careful step forward. You haven't eaten in days, she said quietly. He didn't reply. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkened. Please, she continued, placing the tray gently on his desk. You don't have to talk. Just eat something. You'll feel better. Arthur wanted to shout again, to push her away, but he couldn't. His voice failed him. He watched as she straightened up, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and turned to leave. But before she did, she said something that would linger in his mind long after she was gone. I know what it's like to live in the dark, but even the smallest light can change everything. Then she left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Arthur sat there in silence, staring at the tray, at the soup still steaming, at the little folded napkin beside it, at the single white flower she had placed next to the plate. It was such a simple gesture, yet it felt monumental. No one had done something like that for him in a very long time. Not out of duty, but out of kindness. He reached for the spoon, his hand trembling slightly. He tasted the soup. It was warm, comforting, simple, and strangely, it brought tears to his eyes. He didn't even know why. Change within. That night, Arthur couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about her eyes, the way they had looked into his without fear or judgment. He tried to dismiss it. She's just a maid, he told himself. She doesn't know me. She doesn't understand. But deep down, he knew she had seen more of him in those few seconds than anyone else ever had. The next morning, he found himself waiting, listening for the faint sound of her footsteps in the hall. When he heard her humming again, something inside him softened. Over the following days, he began to notice her even more. The way she tied her hair, the way she smiled when talking to the gardener, the way she sometimes stopped to look at the horizon from the balcony, her eyes lost in thought. She had brought light into his home without even realizing it. Arthur, the man who once despised everyone, started feeling something he didn't recognize at first. Curiosity, warmth, and eventually something even deeper. But he fought it. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself he didn't need her. And yet, every time she passed by his door, his heart, the heart he thought was long dead, began to beat just a little faster. The awakening that night, Arthur walked to the window and opened it fully for the first time in months. The cool wind rushed in, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender, her favorite perfume. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, and for the first time in years, he felt alive. Somewhere deep within, he knew something had shifted, something irreversible. He didn't understand it yet, but Isabella had awakened something inside him that had been buried for too long, and though he didn't know it, she too felt something strange stirring within her, a quiet pull toward the man everyone else feared. It was the beginning of something neither of them could stop, the first spark of a love that would heal two broken souls. The mansion had changed, subtly at first, but enough for everyone to feel it. The air didn't seem as heavy anymore, the shadows didn't linger as long, and every corner of that enormous house began to hum softly with something that hadn't existed there in years. Life. And it all began with silence, not the kind of silence that comes from loneliness, but the kind that speaks louder than words ever could. Isabella continued her work quietly, never overstepping boundaries, never demanding attention, yet everything she did carried meaning. She cleaned the same way she lived, gently, patiently and with care. The morning routine. Every morning she would pass Arthur's door and leave a tray. Breakfast, neatly arranged, always accompanied by a folded note. Sometimes the notes were simple. It's a beautiful morning. You should see the sunrise. I hope today feels a little lighter than yesterday. Don't forget, even clouds move aside for the sun. Other times, they were little drawings, a bird on a branch, a rose beginning to bloom. She didn't know if he ever read them, but she wrote them anyway. Inside the room, Arthur would watch from his bed as the shadow under the door shifted. Her footsteps, the sound of the tray being placed down, the faint rustle of paper. He waited until she walked away before opening the door to read. At first, he thought her messages were foolish, naive, but something about them stayed with him. There was sincerity in her handwriting, small, rounded letters that seemed to carry a warmth he hadn't felt in years. And before he realized it, those little notes became the only thing he looked forward to each day. The first smile. One afternoon, as Isabella was dusting the piano in the grand hall, she felt eyes watching her. She turned, slowly, and there he was, standing by the stairs. Arthur. He was dressed in a simple white shirt, his hair slightly messy, his expression unreadable. It was the first time she'd seen him outside his room. For a moment neither spoke. The ticking of the clock was the only sound in the room. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "You play?" She blinked, surprised. "No, sir. I only clean it." He walked closer, his steps hesitant, as if afraid the floor might betray his emotions. "My mother used to play," he murmured. "This piano hasn't made a sound since she died." Isabella ran her hand lightly over the keys. "Maybe it's time it did again." Arthur looked at her for a long time. There was no arrogance, no coldness, just a deep, searching sadness, and something softer underneath. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. But that night, long after everyone had gone to sleep, the faint sound of the piano drifted through the halls. A hesitant melody, fragile, trembling, but alive. Isabella smiled to herself as she listened from her room. He was healing, slowly, quietly, but he was healing. Unspoken words. As the days passed, Arthur began leaving his room more often. At first it was just to walk to the library or sit by the window. Then he started spending hours in the garden where Isabella worked among the flowers. He didn't speak much, sometimes not at all, but his silence no longer felt like rejection. It was different now. It was comfortable. There were moments when their eyes met across the garden. No words were exchanged, yet entire conversations seemed to happen in those glances, about sorrow, hope, and the strange peace that comes when two broken souls recognize each other. One afternoon, Isabella was trimming the roses when he appeared beside her. He stood silently for a while, watching her hands move carefully among the thorns. "You're not afraid of getting hurt?" he asked finally. She smiled faintly. "Sometimes you have to touch the thorns to reach the beauty." Arthur didn't answer, but that night her words echoed in his mind long after he tried to sleep. The letter that changed everything. A week later, she found something unexpected under the breakfast tray she left by his door, a folded piece of paper. Her heart skipped. He had written back. It wasn't long, but it was enough to make her eyes fill with tears. "You said the sun always finds a way to return. I looked outside today. You were right. A.V." It was the first time he had acknowledged her notes, and the first time he had written anything in months. From then on, their silent exchange continued. Notes left on trays, folded pages under doors, sometimes just a single line or word, but each one built a bridge between them, invisible yet unbreakable. They never spoke about the pain directly. They didn't need to. Every message carried the unspoken truth that neither dared to say out loud, "You are not alone anymore." A new kind of peace. As winter approached, the mansion looked different. The curtains were open, the fireplaces lit. There were flowers again, real ones. Arthur began meeting Mr. Duarte for coffee in the mornings, and even the staff noticed the change. "He smiles now," one of the maids whispered. "Did you see?" He actually smiled. But it wasn't just a smile. It was the faint light of a soul waking up after years of darkness. Isabella, however, never took credit for it. She continued working as before, quiet, humble, kind. She never asked for his attention. She never tried to step into his world. Yet every time she passed by, Arthur's gaze followed her, unseen but full of gratitude. He found himself waiting for her. for her voice, her laughter, her letters. And though he didn't understand it yet, what he felt wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, something he hadn't felt since he was a boy. It was love, fragile, forbidden, and pure. The moment of realization. One evening, a storm broke over the ocean. The rain fell hard against the glass, and the mansion seemed to tremble with every gust of wind. Arthur was in the library, reading one of his mother's old books, when he heard the faint sound of footsteps. Isabella entered quietly to close the windows. Her hair was slightly wet from the rain, her cheeks flushed with color. She looked radiant, alive in a way the storm could never dim. For a long moment, he simply watched her. The way she moved, the gentleness of her hands, the peace that followed her. Everywhere, he realized in that moment that the house wasn't the only thing she had brought back to life. She had resurrected him. And as lightning flashed outside and thunder rolled across the sky, Arthur finally understood that silence was no longer his prison. It was their shared language. Every glance, every note, every quiet moment between them had been building towards something neither could deny. For the first time in years, Arthur whispered to himself, maybe the light was never gone. I just forgot where to look. And deep inside his heart, he knew exactly who had shown it to him. The next few weeks felt like a dream. Ethan began to wake up earlier, drawn by the soft sound of Mia's voice humming through the hallways as she cleaned. The house, once silent and cold, now echoed with faint melodies, laughter, and the distant sound of life returning. For the first time in years, he wanted to live, to see the day unfold, to breathe air that wasn't heavy with despair. He found himself waiting by the window each morning, pretending to be reading or checking his phone, just so he could catch a glimpse of her as she arrived. Sometimes he would open the door before she even rang the bell, pretending it was a coincidence. Mia would smile, shy but kind, her eyes lighting up in that way that made him forget how empty he had once felt. They began to talk, first about simple things, like the weather, or how much dust seemed to gather in one day. But soon, their conversations deepened. She told him about her life, about how she had come from a small town where people didn't have much but shared everything. She spoke of her younger siblings, her mother who worked 2 jobs, and how she had learned to be strong not because she wanted to, but because life had given her no other choice. Ethan listened more than he had ever listened to anyone. There was something magnetic about her sincerity. She wasn't impressed by his wealth or looks. In fact, she seemed to ignore both. When he tried to show off his cars or art collection, she smiled politely and changed the subject to something real. For the first time, someone looked at him and saw not a millionaire, but a man, lost, broken, and searching. One afternoon, as the rain poured outside, the power went out. The mansion fell into darkness, and Mia froze for a moment. Ethan found candles and placed them around the living room. The flickering light made her skin glow like bronze, her eyes deep and alive. They sat together in silence for a while, listening to the rain hit the glass walls. Then she said softly, "You have everything, but you seem so far away from life. Why?" He hesitated. No one had ever dared to ask him that. But there, in the dim light, surrounded by warmth that had been missing for so long, he finally spoke. He told her about his loneliness, how fame and fortune had turned him into a ghost of himself. He spoke about the pressure, the expectations, the endless nights when he thought about ending everything because nothing felt real anymore. Mia's eyes filled with tears, not of pity, but of compassion. She took his hand, the first human touch he had felt in years that wasn't cold or calculated. Her touch was warm, grounding, human. "You're not broken," she whispered. "You're just waiting for someone to remind you how to feel again." Something inside Ethan cracked open. For so long he had been surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Attention, money, prestige. But here was someone who simply wanted to understand him. That night, long after Mia had left, Ethan stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, his heart racing with something unfamiliar, hope. The next morning he found himself walking through the garden, breathing deeply. He could smell the flowers again, hear the wind through the trees. It was as if color had returned to his world, and it was all because of her. From that day on, Ethan began to change. He stopped avoiding people. He started smiling again, awkwardly at first, then naturally. He began helping Mia with small chores, even though she told him he didn't have to. Sometimes he cooked breakfast for her before she arrived, just to see her surprised face when she found the table already set. But with every step closer they grew, Ethan also began to fear something he had never feared before: losing her. Because deep down, he knew she wasn't part of his world. She didn't belong to the glittering circle of wealth and luxury that had once defined him. She belonged to something purer, something real. And for the first time, Ethan realized that the world he had once built, the world of money and power, might not be enough to keep the only person who had truly saved him. It was then that his greatest challenge began: not to keep his fortune, but to fight for the woman who had given him back his life. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's mansion, once a silent monument to isolation, had transformed into a living, breathing space again. The scent of fresh coffee filled the mornings. The sound of laughter, hers, light and genuine, replaced the echo of loneliness that had haunted the halls for years. For the first time, Ethan realized that happiness wasn't loud or extravagant. It was quiet, humble, and often came disguised as a simple moment, like when Mia hummed softly while cleaning the library, or when she smiled as sunlight touched her face. Ethan tried to deny it, but the truth grew stronger. Every day, he was falling in love. Not with her beauty, though she was stunning in a way that defied fashion, but with her strength, her kindness, the way she saw goodness in everyone, even in him. She had walked into his life without asking for anything, and somehow, she had given him everything. But love, he soon learned, was never simple. One morning, Ethan's longtime friend and business partner Andrew stopped by unannounced. He hadn't seen Ethan in months and was stunned by the changes. The curtains were open, sunlight filled the room, and Ethan, once pale and withdrawn, looked alive again. But what truly caught Andrew's attention was Mia, quietly polishing the glass table, her hair tied in a loose bun, her expression peaceful. Andrew smirked. "So this is what brought you back to life? The maid?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Her name is Mia," he said quietly, "and she's the reason I'm still standing." Andrew laughed, shaking his head. "Come on, Ethan, you're a millionaire. You could have anyone. Actresses, models, women from your world. Don't tell me you're falling for someone who cleans your floors." Those words stung more than Ethan expected. He realized how deeply ingrained his old world's arrogance was, even in his friends, even in the man he used to be. For years he had judged people by their wealth, their looks, their status. And now, standing there defending Mia, he saw how shallow that life had been. That night, as rain poured again, as if destiny repeated itself whenever his heart was tested, Ethan found Mia in the kitchen, washing dishes by candlelight, because the storm had knocked the power out once more. He watched her silently for a moment before saying, "Do you ever wonder why life puts certain people in our path?" She turned, surprised by his serious tone. "All the time," she said softly. "I think people come into our lives for a reason, sometimes to teach us, sometimes to heal us." He stepped closer. "And what if they do both?" Her breath caught. She didn't look away, but he could see the conflict in her eyes. She wasn't naive. She knew the world he came from, a world where love like theirs wasn't supposed to exist. "Ethan," she whispered, "you don't belong to my world, and I don't belong to yours." He smiled sadly. "Then maybe we should make our own." In that moment, something broke between them, the invisible wall that had kept them apart for weeks. Ethan reached for her hand, hesitant at first, then with the quiet certainty of a man who finally knew what he wanted. Mia didn't pull away. Their hands intertwined naturally, as if they had always been meant to fit together. They spent hours talking that night, about life, fear, dreams, and second chances. Ethan confessed things he had never told anyone: how money had become a prison, how fame had drained his soul, how he had once believed he was unworthy of love. Mia listened, her eyes glistening, her fingers tracing circles on his palm as if trying to erase his pain. And then, under the soft flicker of candlelight, she whispered, "You were never unworthy. You were just lost." The rain softened outside, the wind quieted, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt peace, not the kind that came from luxury or success, but the kind that came from being truly seen and loved for who he was. The following days were filled with moments that felt almost sacred. They cooked together, laughed over burnt pancakes, walked in the garden hand in hand. Mia taught him to appreciate the simple joys he had long forgotten: the smell of rain on earth, the beauty of silence, the warmth of an embrace without expectation. But love always invites fear, fear of loss, of judgment, of the cruel whispers of the world outside. Ethan's staff began to gossip. Neighbors talked. Rumors spread like wildfire. The millionaire has fallen for his maid. Mia noticed the change first. The looks, the whispers, the subtle distance people created around her. She tried to hide it, but Ethan saw the sadness growing in her eyes. One evening, she told him she was thinking of quitting. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "People are talking. They're saying horrible things about you, about me. I don't want to ruin your name." Ethan's heart clenched. "My name means nothing without you," he said firmly. "Let them talk. Let them mock. I don't care." But Mia shook her head. "You think you don't care now, but one day you might. And I couldn't live, knowing I was the reason you lost everything." That night, as she left the mansion, Ethan stood by the window, watching her disappear into the dark. The pain was unbearable, sharper than any loneliness he had ever felt. He realized then that he could lose all his fortune and survive, but losing her would destroy him. As the storm raged outside, Ethan made a promise to himself. He would not let her go. Not this time. Not after she had saved his soul from the abyss. He didn't yet know how, but he would fight for her, for the love that had brought him back to life. And the next morning, as the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, he began to plan something that would change both their lives forever. The morning after Mia left was suffocatingly silent. Ethan woke up in a house that no longer felt like home. The walls seemed to echo with her absence. No soft footsteps in the hallways. No faint humming as she worked. No warmth in the air. Everything he had once taken for granted now reminded him of her. The scent of lavender from the cleaning supplies. The breakfast table where she used to sit with a shy smile. The garden she had brought back to life with her laughter. Days turned into weeks, but Ethan couldn't move on. He tried to bury himself in his old world again. Meetings, parties, business dinners, but none of it filled the void. The more he tried to return to who he was, the more he realized that man no longer existed. The empty version of himself, the arrogant, lonely millionaire, had died the day she looked into his eyes. He began searching for her quietly, visiting the neighborhood where she had once told him she lived. But no one knew where she had gone. Some said she had moved to another city to help her mother. Others whispered that she had been offered a better job. The uncertainty tortured him. Each night, he would walk through the dark corridors of his mansion, imagining her still there, her voice, her scent, her laughter. Then, one cold evening, fate intervened. Ethan was driving through the city when he saw her, standing outside a small diner, wearing a simple coat, holding a paper bag. She looked tired, but her eyes still had that light that had once saved him. Without thinking, he stopped the car and ran to her. "Mia." She froze, surprised. When she turned and saw him, her expression softened, but there was pain behind her smile. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" "I've been looking for you," he said, breathless. "Every day. I couldn't let you just disappear." She looked down. "You shouldn't have. You have a life, Ethan. You belong to another world." He shook his head, his voice trembling. "That world means nothing to me now. You're my world." For a moment, neither spoke. The city lights flickered on wet pavement. The wind whispered through the trees, and time seemed to stop. Then Mia sighed, her eyes glistening with tears. "I left because I didn't want to be a burden," she said. "People talked. They said I was using you. I couldn't stand to see them tear you apart for something pure." Ethan took a step closer. "You weren't a burden. You were the only truth in my life. They can say what they want. I won't lose you again." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple silver ring, elegant, unpretentious, beautiful in its honesty. "This isn't about money," he said softly. "It's about what's real. I don't want a life full of things. I want a life full of you." Mia's lips trembled and tears rolled down her cheeks. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she placed her hand over his heart. "You were lost when I met you," she whispered. "But now you've found yourself. You don't need me to save you anymore." He smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but I need you to live." They stood there under the city lights, two souls who had found each other again despite everything that had tried to pull them apart. Slowly she nodded, not in surrender, but in acceptance. And that Night, for the first time, they didn't return to a mansion or a palace of marble and glass. They walked hand in hand through the rain to a small cafe nearby. They sat at a corner table, sharing a simple meal, laughing like two people who had nothing, yet possessed everything that mattered. Months passed. Ethan sold several of his luxury properties and began funding community projects in the poorer areas of the city, the same kinds of places Mia had come from. Together they built a foundation to help families in need, to bring hope where there had been none. He used his wealth not to impress, but to heal, and everywhere he went, Mia was by his side, reminding him that true greatness wasn't about power, but compassion. The gossip faded. People stopped whispering when they saw how genuinely happy he was. Even Andrew, the friend who had once mocked him, came to him one evening and said quietly, "You were right, Ethan. She changed you, and maybe she changed all of us too." Years later, on the anniversary of the day they met, Ethan took Mia to the garden of the old mansion, now a retreat home for young people struggling with depression. It had become a place of healing, a sanctuary for those lost in the darkness he once knew too well. As the sun began to set, Ethan turned to her and said, "You saved me when I didn't believe I could be saved. I thought money could buy happiness, but you showed me that love, real love, is the only thing that heals." Mia smiled, resting her head against his chest. "And you taught me that even broken hearts can bloom again when given kindness." They stood there, surrounded by the gentle rustle of leaves and the scent of blooming roses, the same ones Mia had planted years before. The wind carried their laughter through the garden, mingling with the soft whispers of hope from the people who now called that place home. Ethan looked at her, eyes full of gratitude. "If I could go back," he said softly, "I'd still want you to walk into my room that day, the day everything began." She smiled, tears shimmering in her eyes. "And I'd still look into your eyes," she whispered, "and see the man you were always meant to be." In that moment, everything came full circle. The arrogant millionaire who had once turned his back on the world had found redemption not through wealth, but through love. And the simple girl who had once been hired to clean his house had cleansed his soul instead, with kindness, courage, and an unshakable heart. As twilight fell, Ethan wrapped his arms around her, and the two of them stood there, proof that sometimes the most unexpected people are the ones sent to save us. And that love, when it's true, doesn't just heal the heart, it transforms it forever.